Hello! Today we're going to be discussing a game which really doesn't need much of an introduction. A game that trends multiple times a year, with hopeful fans eager for a remaster, just so they can explain to a whole new cohort of players that they're probably playing it wrong. I am of course talking about Bloodborne. Developed by FromSoftware, the developers behind the Dark Souls series, Elden Ring, and one of my favourite game series of all time, Armored Core. Headed by Hidetaka Miyazaki, Bloodborne was originally announced back in 2014, under the name Project Beast, and eventually saw its full release on March 24, 2015 as a PlayStation exclusive. A lone traveller, a cursed town, a deadly mystery that swallows everything it touches. Face your fears as you enter the decaying city of Yharnam, a forsaken place ravaged by a terrible, all-consuming illness. Scour its darkest shadows, fight for your life with blades and guns, and discover secrets that will make your blood run cold, but just might save your skin. In this video, my goal is to analyse Bloodborne's game design and discuss what about the game is so great, and then the not so great as well. To do this, we'll look at the level design, reviewing how easy it is to navigate your environment and the atmosphere it generates. We'll also reflect on both architecture and colour theory. Following this, we'll dive into the player experience, looking at the idea of game feel, flow, and feedback. We'll also examine the gameplay loop and the effectiveness of each core mechanic, before finishing up with a reflection of the game's narrative. And finally, I'll give my review of the game as a whole. But, fair warning, this is the only Souls-like game I have ever played. My first playthrough of Bloodborne, as of this recording, was about 2 years ago. Before making this video though, I wanted a fresher experience with the game. The first time I played, I streamed it, so I was a little more distracted at times and likely missed key story elements. But I tried to pay more attention in this second playthrough, which will hopefully help me as I attempt to explain what I think the storyline was later on, but we'll see I guess. Anyway, just in case you don't know what Bloodborne is, here is the setup. You play as an out-of-town hunter, awakening before an old man who implies you are seeking something called pale blood. You sign a contract, receive a blood transfusion before you fall back asleep, and that's kind of the whole setup. After some little creatures protect you from a wolf monster, you sit up, alone, and begin exploring the city of Yharnam, fighting through monstrous creatures in pursuit of pale blood, whatever that is. Also, I want to say thanks for checking out the video, and a special thank you to those supporting me on Patreon, who are helping to make it possible for me to work on these analyses. So with that, let's explore the level design and atmosphere the game provides for its hunters as they embark on their journeys. Atmosphere is the feeling that remains when the rest of the game shuts the hell up. So how does the world make you feel when you sit back from the gameplay? What kind of emotional environment does it surround you with? To answer this, let's start with architectural theory. This is a framework that studies architectural phenomena using scientific logic and methods of experimentation. You can break the analysis of architecture down into 3 categories: look, logic, and feel. We'll use these for our own analysis. The primary style of Bloodborne is that of Gothic, found in 13th to 15th century Europe, though has seen revivals in both the 17th and 19th centuries as well. Originally deriving from France and Germany, it can be seen across most of Europe at this point, usually styling cathedrals, churches, and educational buildings such as colleges. They feature tall pointed archways, giving a more vertical feeling. Inside are diagonal rib-like arch sections making up the skeleton of the building. Atop, they feature tall spires, towers, and buttresses, which almost seek to touch the heavens themselves. Often covered with biblical symbolism in the form of stained glass windows and stone statues, for example, gargoyles and monstrous beasts. Bloodborne likely takes inspiration from various elements of Gothic styles, with more British styling such as central towers standing above the remaining structure, but larger entranceways more popularised in French Gothic architecture. Though the game does a great job of blending other architectural styles to make areas feel unique from one another. The lower street levels of Yharnam feel closer to a Victorian style featuring decorative dark woods, whereas Old Yharnam has an almost neo-Baroque architectural style, with more rounded archways and decorative recesses to display statues. The Gothic stylings are supported in an interview with Hidetaka Miyazaki stating, "Aspects of both Gothic and Cthulhu-style horror, but it's the former that's depicted from the start and provides a guide for the game's visual feel." The Cthulhu Lovecraftian element is mostly depicted through the religious symbolism which adorns the buildings. For example, statues inside the cathedrals of the presumed Great Ones. So that's a brief summary of the look, but what about the logic of the environment? This refers to the architecture itself making sense. A door should have a room behind it, a building should be self-contained, not featuring meaningless empty space behind walls. And this extends to the outside as well. Roads and paths should lead to somewhere, and often lead back around. Bloodborne does this particularly well, and integrates the level layout effectively with the flow of gameplay. Yharnam feels like a real city. Streets linked together to open squares where a market might stand if not having been torn down by monsters. Everything is interwoven and even features houses, warehouses, a sewage system, main squares, cathedral, and a forest with a small village as well. It all makes some logical sense that under different circumstances, people might simply live here. Some of the links between areas are connected via sometimes incredibly lengthy ladders, but these tools are utilised enough throughout the whole game that it doesn't feel out of place. This feels like a normal thing for the world we hunt within. The game also provides shortcuts behind previously locked doors should you ever need to retread your steps, and seamlessly links the world and pathways together. These things work together to immerse the player in a more believable environment, which allows the player to emotionally connect, leading us to the feel which architecture can elicit. High-rise buildings have been suggested to have a negative effect on one's mental state, even in a virtual environment. Psychological restoration refers to one's ability to recover depleted resources in an environment, be it physical energy, emotional needs, or even improving stress levels. Lindell and Hartig suggest that building height can increase a feeling of enclosure, which can negatively correlate with the likelihood of psychological restoration. Another paper suggests that high-rise buildings can generate a threatening atmosphere, leading to behavioural freezing and defensive responses. Essentially, it can impact one's ability to properly enact their fight or flight response. Coined by Walter Cannon in 1915, and also known as the acute stress response, this describes one's split-second decision-making when confronted with a high-stress situation, often associated with fear or danger. It could be suggested that when playing Bloodborne, especially on the streets of Yharnam or similarly built-up areas of the game, the player may have additional psychological pressure during the combat, and inhibitions towards their decision-making. Another emotional impact is potentially the feeling of insignificance. Cathedrals, especially those of the Gothic variety, were built to ascend as close to the heavens as man could achieve, forcing those below to look up in awe, a theme that feels prominent in Bloodborne, with its Lovecraftian iconography and strong focus on the moon. The game's environment constantly encourages the player to look upwards to the heavens and be reminded of the moon, the night, and thus the hunt. So I would suggest Bloodborne's architecture perfectly encourages an atmosphere which allows the player to feel defensive and somewhat burdened psychologically, and as we'll discuss in more detail later, could be quite in keeping with the game's narrative themes. But that's not all these tool structures achieve. Outside of looking interesting, making logical sense, and impacting the way the player feels, these structures also manage to support gameplay. When it comes to navigating an environment, it's important to have landmarks which allow an individual the ability to orientate themselves effectively. For example, theme parks utilise landmarks, or weenies, to give visitors visual magnets they can use to easily know where they are and where they are going, and video games act no different. We can break landmarks down into three categories, those being micro, meaning small, meso, meaning medium, and macro, meaning large. For this chapter, we'll just focus on macro. We'll discuss the others in the following chapter. Though, it's worth noting that not all of Bloodborne's environments utilise macro landmarks, but generally, when used, it uses them effectively, especially early on. Yharnam, Old Yharnam, and the Cathedral Ward, for example, all give the player towering buildings to guide them, often also serving as the objective location as well. This is a much needed tool at times, as the game does not give the player any form of mini-map to traverse their surroundings, and the colour palette can sometimes make areas feel disorientating. Again, we'll discuss the game's colour palette more in the next chapter. But in more open areas of the game, where a player tends to have more freedom to explore and potentially get lost, the game uses macro landmarks, such as tall cathedral steeples or large prominent towers, to draw the player's eye. This helps support the player without needing to interrupt the gameplay by forcing them to check their map. The objectives blend naturally into the architectural style, which furnishes the landscape. So I would suggest Bloodborne's architectural design is nothing short of superb, and I honestly couldn't imagine a more fitting theme for the game's environments. It supports an atmosphere of psychological pressure and makes the player feel tiny and enclosed. And with that in mind, we can turn to a more detailed aspect of the level design. As a player, we are far smaller in stature, so how does the game's level design feel when up close and personal? One element that immediately stands out in Bloodborne is the use of colour. In particular, the low saturated nature of the immediate surroundings. This directly contrasts with the saturation of the sky at times. What's interesting about saturation is that it can impact a person's orientation response, which refers to an individual's involuntary shift of attention that appears to be a fundamental biological mechanism necessary for survival. Essentially, your ability to react to visual stimuli. So in the case of Bloodborne, it might be how quickly you notice an enemy hiding behind a collection of crates, or a boss's animation before a specific type of attack. This also gives the designers a powerful tool to highlight important information to the player. For instance, they can use more vibrant tones to effectively draw a person's attention to danger, elements of the user interface, or key locations. One noticeable contrast is the more muted ground and the sometimes vibrant night sky. I wonder if this again is a tool to encourage players to gaze upwards. Another visual element that affects the look of the level design is the use of lighting. Being a horror game, it is to be expected that darkness would be utilised. Often when the player finds themselves indoors, in an enclosed space, here, the lighting is often dimmed and shadows more prominent, further hindering your ability to read your surroundings. Environmental darkness may elicit unpleasant feelings such as insecurity, tension, or anxiety. These, in association with the hindrance to psychological restoration, could potentially fatigue a player's reactions further, keeping them engaged yet vulnerable. Bloodborne's visual stylings all feel engineered towards damaging the player's ability to react. Much like how increased saturation can be used to indicate information to the player when contrasted with the low, so can lighting. Warm oranges or bright whites break through the dark and dreary world to help guide the player and grant some small slither of hope. This is important because as one's ability to react is hindered, the developers don't want this to impede a player's navigational skills. We'll discuss why this is so important in the following chapter, but throughout the game's areas you will notice lighting guiding you through various locations, but that's not the only form of visual support. As stated in chapter 1, alongside macro landmarks are micro and meso. Bloodborne generally does an excellent job of populating almost every inch of every level with unique feeling imagery. For instance, micro landmarks or signposts could be the use of dead figures, burning effigies, or statues. Examples of meso landmarks are a little larger and can be seen from further away, such as mid-sized buildings, bridges, and in Bloodborne's case, sizably crucified monsters. These again ensure the player is able to quickly identify their position. Is this somewhere new, or somewhere you've been before? And by linking these unique set pieces, you're able to immediately orientate yourself in terms of the world map. In contrast to the more built up urban locations, there are other situations that sometimes suffer from missing out on macro scaled landmarks. For example, the Forbidden Woods. This location is dominated by trees and nature, with some small pockets of wooden shacks and stone obelisks which provide some form of meso and micro landmarking. This region somewhat struggles to create as many unique views for the player. For example, the snake-infested area is visually similar throughout. Likewise, there is maybe my least favourite setting in the game, the Nightmare Frontier, which can be very disorientating. Almost every direction the player turns here feels somewhat similar to the next, aside from the Amygdala's chamber, the only real structure in this region. There is some use of lanterns along some pathways and some other smaller points of interest, but generally an unremarkable area to traverse, and players can easily get lost within it. These areas can really make you appreciate the use of buildings and height in other locations. I believe where the Nightmare Frontier differs from the more interesting locations is the lack of leading lines. Leading lines are tangible or intangible lines in the frame, created by things like roads, buildings, signs, arrows, or light in the background that lead the viewer's eyes in a particular direction. This is important again because it all flows into the readability of the game. Bloodborne clearly wants you to know where you are going, but not see what is coming, and I would put forward that the less built up the environment, the weaker it is at achieving this goal. Another key component for the level's design is the concept of progress. Bloodborne can sometimes feel like a punishing experience, when a hunter succumbs to an unforeseen attack and must make their way back to where they failed prior. This often means traversing through the level again and again. One way that the game lessens this burden is by providing lamps. These operate as checkpoints, where the player can visit the hunter's dream to level up and quickly travel back and forth between set locations. Each time a player comes across a lamp, it feels like a step forwards. This feeling is further encouraged by making this a guaranteed reward for any boss you manage to defeat. On top of lamps, the level's design sometimes intricately offers the player the ability to loop around. On your travels, you will likely come across some form of locked door. There are two types of locked door in Bloodborne: hard gates and optional gates. Hard gates are designed to halt the player's progression completely by forcing them to explore the environment before moving on. So for example, not being able to move to the next location until a specific boss has been defeated. Then there are optional gates. These can simply be ignored completely, but do function as a form of reward, as a player can open them up as a shortcut from the other side. Again, these instill a sense of progression and allow more free movement around the region, whilst also making a player feel compensated for their exploration. Speaking of exploration, the levels also often conceal secret areas, further encouraging players to scout the area. Key items can be stumbled across and obscure NPCs encountered. Lamps, looping shortcuts and hidden secrets make the levels feel intricately crafted and built with purpose. It also adds to the feeling of logic we discussed in Chapter 1. The world makes sense and feels like it all interlinks. Which brings me to the idea of form follows function, a concept which comes from the late 19th century from American architect Louis Sullivan. It recommends that a building's purpose should be at the forefront of its design rather than its aesthetic. Bloodborne's level design somehow manages to feel crafted from the perspective of purpose, whilst also aesthetically achieving a believably yet tragic world that supports an emotional environment befitting the game's themes. But as excellent as the game's world can sometimes feel, it does have some issues. When designing a level, there are two key pathways a designer should consider: the critical path and the golden path. The critical path refers to the quickest and most direct route to beating the level, and the golden path is the designer's preferred route. It's the one you expect most players to take and the one which will offer the optimal experience. When playing Bloodborne and exploring a level, sometimes you can come to realise you can just run through everything. You can ignore almost every lower class enemy in the game and jump from boss encounter to boss encounter. The critical path is incredibly accessible to the player. In my playthrough, I would work my way through a location, slaying every beast until I met an ill fate and died. At which point, upon respawning, I would run through everything to get back to my previous location, utilising any shortcuts I'd unlocked along the way. On the one hand, I would appreciate the interconnected world and seamless ability to rush back to where I previously was. But, on the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder why I fought my way through all these creatures in the first place. It was a continually deflating realisation. I couldn't help but register that I was basically grinding blood echoes in each area, which I could do almost anywhere in the game at any point. It even got to a point where if I encountered an enemy I didn't like, or couldn't be bothered to fight, I could just run past them. The world suddenly lost its ability to put me on the defensive. The environment no longer encouraged that feeling of enclosed dread, or uphill struggle as I fought through a barrage of monsters. I had almost too much agency, and it really hurt the feeling the game had so beautifully crafted prior. I'm not sure if more hard gates would have been beneficial to the level's flow, but something felt strange when I opted to run past the giant spider room and the patiently waiting hunters as I proceeded to the next checkpoint with nothing that could stand in my way. The game may overly rely on the player's curiosity to lead them down a more golden path, but some secrets can be quite difficult to locate, and with battles with lesser enemies feeling increasingly meaningless with rewards for killing them being fairly unremarkable, it was the one glaring design issue I found with the level's layout. I strongly believe much of the visual design is specifically intended to inhibit pattern recognition during high stress moments in the game. As discussed in Chapter 1, the height-focused architecture can weaken one's fight or flight response, and inhibit psychological restoration. The lower saturated environments can also be suggested to further damage a player's orientation response, again weakening their ability to react. Darker lighting increases tension and slows the player's pace as they fear what could come next, and the world beautifully interconnects, making for a well-crafted region to explore with plenty to discover. But once the player begins to realise they needn't slow their pace, that their ability to sprint defeats all obstacles aside from boss encounters, the previously excellently crafted atmosphere begins to falter. And this perfectly leads us to the next chapter topic, player experience. And if you're enjoying the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. But let's continue. Player experience denotes the individual and personal experience of playing games. Player experience describes the qualities of the player-game interactions and is typically investigated during and after the interaction with games. Often also referred to as user experience, it refers to how you, the player, feel about an interaction with a video game or piece of software. Good design, when it's done well, becomes invisible. It's only when it's done poorly that we notice it. As discussed in the 2 prior chapters, navigation in Bloodborne is supported by the use of landmarks, signposting, clever lighting, leading lines, and more. These all help to ensure a player effortlessly recognises where they need to go. Without thinking, a player just knows, and this is what makes for an excellent player experience. It can sometimes become a thankless achievement, but the less a player notices the design, often the better it is. And this leads us to the idea of game flow. Flow tends to occur when a person faces a clear set of goals that require appropriate responses. It is the balance between challenge and skill, and this can apply to almost all elements of a game's design, be it the ability to navigate their surroundings or ability to defeat a particular enemy. If an element of the game is too easy or too difficult to comprehend, it can quickly enact a sense of boredom. The same can be said for a game's challenge. If too easy or too difficult to achieve it, it can generate a feeling of frustration and players can begin to lose interest. Essentially, a bad player experience breaks flow. Schaefer, in 2013, proposed 7 conditions that must be met prior to a feeling of flow being achievable. These were knowing what to do, knowing how to do it, knowing how well one is doing, knowing where to go if navigation is involved, high perceived challenges, high perceived skills, and freedom from distractions. And I would suggest all of these are interconnected with the concept of player experience. So we're going to use Schaefer's methods to facilitate flow as a structure to review Bloodborne's ability to provide a flow-inducing player experience. Let's begin with knowing what to do. Bloodborne does not overtly guide the player, but instead leaves them to discover their own path. Initially, the player is informed they are looking for something known as pale blood. Next, you are greeted by the line,
"Ah, you found yourself a hunter,"
indicating that you, the player, are a hunter. And that's enough to indicate your 2 main objectives, searching for pale blood and hunting enemies. We will discuss the game's narrative design in an upcoming chapter, but ignoring the element of lore for now, you can theoretically play the game and never understand the intricate details of the world around you, but still understand your purpose within it to some extent. And that purpose allows you to know what you need to do. Move forwards through the world looking for pale blood and slay the monsters before you. Having said that, the fact that you can progress throughout the game without explicitly knowing why you killed a particular monster other than it had a large health bar can sometimes pull you out of the game, and certain points of lore can be easily missed, meaning it's quite easy to find yourself not understanding the reasoning behind your smaller objectives, which can sometimes damage your feeling of flow. But what about knowing how to do it? As a baseline, we know we need to progress through the world in search of pale blood and kill the monsters that stand before us. But how do we know how to do this? And this brings us to the topic of tutorialization, and what I'm sure will be a somewhat divisive section of this video. Bloodborne relies almost exclusively on one tool to teach the player the basics, those being the messengers. Small creatures which, when interacted with, will provide the player with a tooltip, such as what button is used to attack or lock onto your enemies. At the very beginning of the game, following these 2 tips, the player encounters their first foe, which allows them to quickly grasp the game's theme, and, if killed here, how death mechanically functions within the game's space. Bloodborne rewards you for learning how to die by granting you weapons which immediately help you in winning this initial combat encounter. This instills the importance of your weapons and gear, but that's about it in terms of the game giving you a space to learn. After this, you enter Yharnam, and you're left to explore and experience the main game. There are some follow-up messengers scattered around which further teach the player specific mechanics through more tooltips, but these are not required reading, and can very much be walked past and missed completely. Bloodborne utilises a passive learning style. This is a process where students receive information from the learning environment and internalise it. In this case, the player receives a tooltip of information and will receive no immediate feedback to their learning. There are both pros and cons to this style of learning. Unfortunately, the pros are often assigned to the teacher's role, or in this case, the designers. A tooltip is very easy to implement and cost effective for designers to simply place down an interactable messenger to educate the player about a mechanic. The drawbacks, however, are that information can be somewhat boring to consume, and there is little to no ability for learning to be assessed. We've all had a class where information is just spoken at us, going in one ear and out the other, and learning in video games is no different. The alternative to this style is active learning. This is an instructional process which engages students to learn through reading, writing, talking, listening, and reflecting, also known as learning by doing. In video games, this is often when a player must actively complete a task in order to progress. For example, Destiny 2 provides the player with a safe training area at the beginning of the game, which serves several purposes for the narrative, but also for the player's learning. It forces the player to actively use mechanics with sequences which prevent the player from moving onwards, such as having to crouch under debris to the next area. Research suggests this to be far more engaging for learners, and it allows the game to assess the player by preventing them from moving forwards until they've shown they know how to use a mechanic. There is an argument for a passive style though. In an article by Neil Druckmann explaining Hidetaka Miyazaki's inclusion in Time magazine's most influential people of 2023, he states, "Miyazaki's games make the player feel accomplished and smart, and it's all thanks to his and his team's uncompromising approach. He refuses to over-explain the mechanics or the lore, but rather puts his trust in the player to figure it out on their own. In terms of explaining the mechanics, I strongly disagree. To ensure flow, it's important that players have a strong foundational understanding of how to do things." Research also suggests that in some cases, active learning leads to higher student cognitive outcomes, and other studies suggest a positive improvement to students' reactions to the learning. So theoretically, tutorialization, which utilizes active learning, could not only be better for player understanding, but also more enjoyable to engage with. And in addition, tooltips in Bloodborne are at about the same level of complexity as Year 1 video game student projects, so I find them to be particularly uninspiring. For example, one of the most satisfying elements of Bloodborne's combat is parrying. A mechanic we'll discuss more later, but essentially, it allows you to counter an incoming attack by using your side pistol at the right moment, and then you can unleash a devastating counterattack. But I remember in my first playthrough of Bloodborne, I didn't really use parrying until the final boss, because this was the first time I felt I really needed to learn and use it. Whereas I think if I had been forced to actively learn it earlier on in the game, it would have been a net benefit to my overall experience. So I would suggest the game is somewhat weaker when it comes to the player knowing how to do it. But tutorialization is not the only way the game can encourage desirable player behaviour. To ensure flow can be achieved, a player also needs to be well informed about how well they are doing. Video games often utilise various forms of feedback when actions take place within the virtual environment to achieve this. In e-games, feedback can improve learning and help the learner to take decisions about his strategy, and it also encourages the learner's motivation. Feedback in games often takes the form of either positive or negative reinforcement. These elements are the basis of operant conditioning, a term coined by B.F. Skinner in 1937, which describes behaviour as controlled by its consequences. The idea here is that if you want an individual to continue practicing a behaviour, you give them a reward, and in contrast, if you want to discourage them from an action, they receive a punishment instead. Bloodborne certainly uses the carrot and stick approach of its players, but with the tone of the game being as it is, it uses subtle techniques between its user interface and audio to elicit rewards and punishment to its players. For instance, the use of blood echoes, a resource which the hunter can spend on oneself to increase their character level and strength. Upon defeating an enemy, the fallen beast will slump to the ground and grant the player some blood echoes, which can be seen in the top right of their heads-up display. You can watch the number not only increase, but rapidly roll upwards, making it feel even more impactful. This is accompanied by a sound effect where the pitch rises from a low note to a higher one, instilling a positive feeling. These techniques are subtle and avoid interrupting the core gameplay, but still essentially tell the player, good job. Providing feedback is closely related to having clear goals, in that they are often accompanied by some feedback. When a player completes a short-term goal, it is essential to have some mechanism that responds to it. In contrast to this, there is being defeated by an enemy. This is accompanied by a sound effect which drops in pitch, encouraging a deflating feeling. Alongside this, the phrase, "You died" appears on the screen, followed by a swift respawn at your last checkpoint lamp. From here, you will notice your blood echo count has fallen to 0, having been dropped to the ground, or collected and held by a monster which killed you, represented by its glowing eyes. There is a punishing hit to your progress, and the game is essentially telling the player to do better. Theoretically, this might encourage the player to either grind to increase their strength or reconsider a new tactic against that enemy. What they tried before did not work. But even within every element of a battle, there is constant feedback being given to the player. Every activation of the attack button results in the attack animation of your weapon. Every successful hit is met with a gruesome cut to their foe, an animation of stagger or a grunt of pain. Interface health bars drop, letting the player know they've successfully done damage and encouraging them to continue. And on the other side, when caught off guard and struck themselves, the player will watch as their own health bar depletes and their character reacts negatively to being struck, a punishment for having not dodged at the correct time. And to bring up the parry mechanic once more, when you do achieve this feat, in my case completely by accident the first time, the game rewards you with a particularly satisfying sound effect. As you watch the enemy stagger to its knees, opening up to a visceral attack which can be equally satisfying to enact. All of these sound effects, animations and UI elements are what we call juice. Juicy things are things that wobble, squirt, bounce around and make little cute noises. It's sort of a catch-all phrase for things that make a game more satisfying to interact with. Even when navigating an options menu and hearing the sound effect as you alter your selection is a form of juice. Not only does Bloodborne provide the player with immediate feedback during their in-game actions, but manages to make them feel particularly satisfying. Consider the feeling of defeating a boss. You finally get to see that huge health bar fully depleted, the sound effects of both success and blood echoes rushing into your UI. A notification stating, "Prey slaughtered," pops across the screen and you spot the highly sought after checkpoint lamp spawning before you. It feels great, but the punishment side of things does have its negative consequences. It was only through repeated deaths that I started to realise I could simply run through enemies without much concern. It would also prove fairly frustrating because in those moments I was no longer in a sense of game flow. I was simply enduring the chore of returning back to my previous location. In small doses, punishment-based stimuli can motivate a player to try other techniques, but the game does not aid in behavioural correction, which can sometimes feel a little frustrating. What I mean is, Bloodborne very much relies on your willingness to trial and error your way through much of the game. Like in the case of Jura, a character atop a tall tower in Old Yarnum, who will fire upon the player with a Gatling gun. You can fight your way through the environment to climb ladders and reach him, and do battle. But he's a tough fight. I travelled to him a fair number of times before I eventually tried a very simple approach. I shot at him repeatedly, relying on the knockback to push him off the edge and thus kill him. I mean, job done, but nothing about that series of interactions felt fun or engaging to me. My sense of game flow was totally broken during that stage of the game. A test subject who receives negative feedback while doing an intrinsically motivated activity will see a decrease in intrinsic motivation. When I, the player, was punished at a time of high motivation, it degraded and damaged my subsequent sense of motivation. So generally, I would suggest Bloodborne does a great job of utilising juicy feedback to encourage the player's positive actions, providing sound effects, checkpoints and UI elements to ensure they know how well they are doing and feeling a sense of achievement. This certainly helps to build a sense of game flow at times. It does the same to inform them of their failings as well. But for me, the game relies too heavily on the player to simply trial and error their way through some situations. The game's negative reinforcement is uninformative at times and can lead to fairly uninspiring moments of frustration, where players are simply rushing past enemies time and time again to return to a particular boss fight, which sometimes damages the same sense of game flow. In terms of knowing where to go, this I won't go into any more detail. Chapter 1 and 2 basically explore this at length. Bloodborne features excellent navigational design outside of perhaps a couple of specific locations, which are a little weaker, but generally is very successful in leading the player to their destination and promoting game flow. FromSoftware has a reputation at this point, the Dark Souls series being well known for being a difficult collection of games to complete, alongside other games in their repertoire. As a result, games from this development team have an immediate perceived challenge, but regardless, the game's design further encourages this atmosphere as well. When struck by an enemy, your health bar tends to lose large chunks. This is purposeful. It encourages the idea that every mistake could be your last, and this adds a sense of danger to every moment in the game. But I believe the finest example, again, is the use of boss battles. Bosses in FromSoftware games tend to be scaled to enormous heights, towering over the player. An intimidating monster of massive proportions which feeds into a David vs Goliath atmosphere, where the player is on the immediate defensive. This combined with the epically sized health bars covering the lower section of the HUD, further this feeling when you compare it to your own health bar in the top left corner. The final juicy element is the unbelievable scores which accompany each mammoth battle, which continue to add to the exciting tense back and forths. And your prize for victory? Progression to the next area filled with new monstrosities and bosses to overcome. The game always provides the player with a feeling of a difficult challenge ahead, and does a great job of making it feel incredibly satisfying to endure and persevere through. And what this helps to achieve is keeping the player in a sense of flow, as their focus stays on the next challenge ahead. But to complete a challenge you perceive to be difficult, you also need As mentioned just prior, FromSoftware games have a reputation at this point, not only of being difficult, but of requiring skill to complete. It's an interesting phenomenon, where some elements of the game's communities can come across as a little bit elitist because they've beaten a game. No deaths and totally hitless runs are a fascinating byproduct, with some particularly skillful people going as far as to use dance mats as their controller. There is a prestige accompanied with beating this hard game, and somehow making it even harder on yourself increases that prestige. Players appear to not only play these games for enjoyment, but for the bragging rights. Further research into the concept of flow suggests an increase in enjoyment, concentration, and self-esteem. I wonder if this could be true of Bloodborne as well. By increasing the challenge, you further encourage your need to concentrate and thus improve your self-esteem as the challenge is increased. Basically, Bloodborne and games like it become a catalyst for people to find themselves in a feeling of flow, and perhaps build upon their self-esteem. What further encourages this is one's ability to express their skill. Learning enemy movement patterns and training your reaction times allow a player to feel accomplished. For example, in my playthrough, my early gameplay is very hack and slash, fairly unthinking, but by the end I was parrying, dodging, and just playing far more gracefully. I better understood what I was doing, and certainly felt more skilled at the game, and that felt really satisfying. But what's interesting about Bloodborne is I would not describe it as a difficult game. It is a game about pattern recognition, and a test of one's patience with trial and error based elements. Instead, I believe it uses a technique to disguise the game's hidden simplicity. Risk versus reward. Risk being the perceived challenge, for example, an enemy which does high amounts of damage per hit, versus the reward, dodging past an attack and damaging its health bar instead. As mentioned earlier, damage to the player tends to be fairly significant when struck. This encourages every combat move to feel risky, but the reward is landing a hit yourself. A great example of this in Bloodborne for me was the Amygdala boss battle, a tall eldritch beast which took increased damage when striking at its head. But to do this you had to strike it shortly after specific attacks, which often led you rolling through its collapsing elongated arms. Getting one or two hits in on the beast felt highly rewarding after what felt like incredibly risky plays. But the game is quite generous, giving the player blood vials to recover your health points after missteps, and the player technically cannot die. You can repeatedly fight the same enemy time and time again until you eventually beat it. It's very interesting. Technically, death in Bloodborne has no risk. Blood echoes can be farmed easily enough, and regions can be rushed through to return to your former location with relative ease. Technically, death in Bloodborne only has the risk of the game's design breaking your sense of flow, by forcing you to run back to where you initially died. But the game does a really good job of providing juicy feedback, and the risk versus reward elements during epic boss battles make the player feel incredibly skilled in that moment. Landing a parry and subsequent visceral attack against a mighty boss feels particularly great, and thus achieves a feeling of flow in those specific battles by encouraging the player to feel like they've expressed a high amount of skill against an enemy which outmatches them. Freedom from distractions. This factor is a little outside of the game's control. This refers more to your own gaming space. For example, if someone walks into your room with a question distracting you, in that instance, your sense of flow can be damaged. The frustration you feel in that moment, that's because you were probably experiencing flow. Csikszentmihalyi suggests that several factors must be experienced to consider a successful state of flow, these being intense and focused concentration, a strong sense of agency, merging of action and awareness, loss of self-awareness, distortion of the experience of time, and experience of the activity as intrinsically rewarding. And looking at that list, I think it's hard to argue that Bloodborne doesn't achieve flow throughout its gameplay. The combat and environment combined keep the player in a sense of concentration, making each of their choices purposeful to not fall victim to an unseen attacker. The ease of navigation and amount of feedback provides the player with an immersive environment to lose themselves in. The high risk, high reward playstyle keeps the player feeling challenged and rewarded for each step towards progress. The only weaker moment of game flow, for me, being when a section feels somewhat repetitive to return to. I think I'd have preferred that upon death to a boss, I was able to immediately try again, rather than enduring the long, somewhat meaningless sprint back to my previous position. Perhaps an option to return to the Hunter's Dream, in case I feel underprepared for a particular boss battle at that time. But I think the shift of my mindset back and forth between epic high-octane boss battles and boring run-through the environment simulator was damaging to my sense of flow. And that's not even including when I would have to interrupt my gameplay completely to restock on blood vials by farming. But ultimately, I think it's fair to say Bloodborne provides a mostly positive player experience, with its ability to generate a state of flow, but doesn't always do the best job of protecting that feeling once it's established. We've now touched on a few of these elements already, but now we need to break down the gameplay itself and look a little deeper at the game's mechanics. Games always feature a core loop. Carlo Fabricatore defines it like this. We can define core gameplay as the set of activities that the player will undertake more frequently during the game experience, and which are indispensable to win the game. Simply put, it's what actions the player repeatedly does during the game. This element itself has to be fun, and not become repetitive and boring, and thus is arguably the most important element of any game's design. Let's deconstruct Bloodborne's core loop. I would suggest the first element of the gameplay loop is exploration. A player is always required to navigate through their surroundings to an objective point. Secondly, a player must fight and defeat various bosses throughout the world, and finally, progressing the narrative and leading to the next location. The loop then continues as you explore, fight more bosses, and progress again. Remember the game's initial objectives? Hunting and pale blood. The core loop perfectly feeds into this idea. Obviously, that is not every mechanic in the game, but generally, all of your game's core mechanics should be in service of the core game loop. If one of your game's mechanics doesn't support your game's core game loop, or your essence statement, you might consider eliminating it. An essence statement is essentially a synopsis of your game, which conveys the player's goal, core gameplay features, and who you play as, usually about a sentence or two long. I was unable to find FromSoftwares' original essence statement for Bloodborne, so we'll focus primarily on the core loop when discussing Bloodborne's mechanics. Fortunately, we have already described much of the core loop's features in previous chapters, but as a quick rundown, exploration in Bloodborne is easy to navigate and satisfying to explore with visually interesting environments and a sense of discovery throughout. Boss battles are intense, flow-inducing experiences which give a strong sense of risk versus reward, and progression in itself feels rewarding, always feeling like a step towards the original objective in some mysterious way, as the night moves forwards, leading the player to new environments to then explore. But these core mechanics, on their own, would likely be insufficient. It is the support from other game functions that make them so enjoyable. So let's break those down in more detail, starting with combat. To defeat a boss, you will need to do battle with it using several other combat-driven functions, these being attack, parry, dodge, lock on, sprint, and use item. Attack, meaning your ability to swing your weapon swiftly at your target or charge up a heavy attack for increased damage with a greater chance to stagger. Each swing uses stamina, which when empty will make your hunter's attacks slower. Players must choose when the optimal moment to strike is and how best to land the hits. Parry. You also carry a sidearm giving you the ability to shoot a weak but ranged attack. When timed correctly during an attacker's lunge, you can parry their attack and leave them stunned. This allows the player to use a visceral attack if close enough, landing massive damage. Dodge. When an enemy lunges an attack in your direction, you can use the dodge ability to evade the incoming strike. This also uses stamina, so must be managed along with your attacks. It can also be used to close gaps with enemies or evade their counterattacks when you land an attack of your own. Lock on. Allows the player to focus their camera on a specific enemy or part of that enemy. An effective tool for tracking, but does suffer some minor camera issues when used on larger enemies, especially when they move directly above you. Sprint. A player can also close gaps with enemies by running at them, or they can use this ability to completely evade and avoid combat altogether. Use item. Bloodborne gives the player a variety of extra tools to use during combat. Blood vials which can restore health, antidotes to cure poison, oil to increase fire damage, beast pellets to increase both incoming and outgoing damage, elemental paper which can add an extra damage modifier to your weapons, and more. The way combat works in Bloodborne is almost like a dance, driven by the idea of intentionally making combat choices. Enabling intentionality is at the heart of all immersive sim gameplay, level design, and system design. Steve Lee breaks down intentionality into 4 elements: choice, motivation, information, and time. Choice refers to having available options, such as when to attack, dodge, parry, use an item, or simply run away. The player has plenty of agency during combat. Your motivation here is to survive the encounter and defeat the monster. Information is based upon affordances. These are things we can understand or learn without the need for explanation. This can sometimes be through the process of trial and error. We slowly learn how enemies will animate in specific ways prior to an attack, giving the player necessary information. And time. This is what allows you to plan your actions during a fight. Are you going to wait for a particular type of attack before launching your counter-offense? Do you need to reposition your hunter to have more room to dodge whatever is coming next? Intentionality feeds into the development of immersion and feeling of flow, and in doing so, these combat functions support the core loop element of defeating bosses. Players can also find new gear in the form of clothing and weapons. These can be changed out at will, along with equipable runes which can be adjusted when in the hunter's dream. In combination, these tools allow players the ability to further adapt their loadout, modifying their offensive and defensive stats. This further supports the boss fighting segment of the core loop. Some bosses have different strengths and weaknesses, sometimes even exuding elemental themes. This permits the player to adapt to a preferable playstyle if they need it. It gives them more intentional choice. The additional benefit of the combat system and equipment is they also support another mechanic, collecting blood echoes. Blood echoes are a form of currency awarded to the player throughout the game for defeating enemies, bosses, and using cold blood items, which can be found throughout the world. These can then be used by the player when they interact with the doll character to level up their character and further improve their stats. You can also spend blood echoes to fortify your weaponry when combined with specific materials. This improves their damage statistics. In the Hunter's Dream, you'll also spot the Bath Messengers, a shop where you can again spend blood echoes to trade for support items, clothing, and weaponry to again prepare yourself for the upcoming battles. All of these supporting mechanics lead into the core feature of defeating bosses. However, there is one more thing blood echoes can be spent doing: repairing your weapons. During gameplay, your weapons will slowly degrade in quality, eventually leading to a UI pop-up warning you of its impending breakage. If the weapon fully degrades, then its damage drastically drops. The only way to repair your weapon is to spend blood echoes when inside the Hunter's Dream. Unlike the other mechanics we've described thus far, this negatively impacts your ability to interact with the core loop. If not kept on top of, you can find your weapon on the verge of breaking midway through a boss battle. It's actually quite deflating and intrusive to your state of game flow. On the other hand, it could be argued that it adds to the punishing world, and perhaps an added sense of realism. The issue is, it's the only form of punishment associated with actively engaging with the core loop, as the weapon degrades through use and use alone. To me, it feels out of place and somewhat unfinished. Like perhaps there was at one point going to be more depth to the repair system, but in the game it merely feels like an additional chore attached to the side of an otherwise clean collection of functionality. It doesn't appear to serve the core loop. The final mechanic associated with boss battles and combat is a simple one: the death function. When the player's health points reach 0, they are slain. "You died" appears across the screen, along with the previously mentioned negative audio cue. Following this, the player respawns at the last checkpoint lamp they interacted with, finding all their blood echoes having been lost. This leads into the blood echo retrieval mechanic, where upon the player dying, their echoes are dropped to the ground or captured by an enemy which must be defeated to retrieve them. This almost acts like a second life, a bit like how when Sonic the Hedgehog is hit, he loses his rings, but can be recollected. Should the player perish again before collecting their pile of lost blood echoes, those echoes will be lost forever. This adds to that element of risk versus reward. If you are holding a lot of blood echoes, venturing forward is ever more risky, but ultimately adds a nice element of pressure to resource rescue missions upon respawn. I think this is a great way to include blood echoes directly into the combat system. So this is maybe the main group of mechanics that the player will use throughout their time playing Bloodborne, but there is one more collection of functions that we need to discuss. Non-playable characters can be found throughout the world, sometimes just standing out in the open, or more hidden, only highlighted by a lit lantern by their window. When interacted with, dialogue begins, occasionally being able to make choices which can impact future dialogue or interactions with other NPCs, sometimes leading to hidden questlines or events. And this is also one of the ways the player can collect pieces of the world's overarching lore, or various other hidden rewards. These interactions can sometimes lead to side quests, for example, being sent out into the world to retrieve a special item, and these can sometimes give you advantages to the player. For example, should you meet Father Gascoigne's daughter before facing him, you will have a music box, which can be used to stun him during your battle, giving you an advantage. The game encourages the player to be inquisitive and search for secrets, sometimes rewarding them with a deeper understanding of the world around them through notes or other means. Again, all supporting the core loop: exploration. So Bloodborne has a strong core loop, with a number of well-designed functions which help support the player's gameplay. Combat and blood echoes empower a hunter to fight off monsters, and the world is filled with secrets to discover, helping to encourage their exploration. Outside of perhaps the repair function, everything directs positively to the core gameplay, making for an excellent player experience. So the world is believable and striking to behold. The level design is mostly easy to navigate and well structured. The player experience can induce a strong feeling of flow, and the gameplay near enough all complements the core loop. So this brings us to the next question: what the hell is even going on? One of the main reasons I wanted to play the game right before making this video was so I could try to piece together the storyline. I remember my first playthrough. I finished the game with a lot of confusion and not really understanding what had transpired. Admittedly, I was streaming, so I likely missed more things and didn't pay as much attention to elements as I could have. So let me just ramble through my notes I took as I played the game, and formulate what I think the narrative was, and please do feel free to correct me in the comments below. Okay, so, I woke up looking for something called Pale Blood. I'm new in the area, so I signed up to a local hunting group to make some new friends, but I didn't read the small print, so the blind man transfused me with some blood too. Then, as I came in and out of consciousness, the big bad wolf came to devour me, only to be set ablaze by the protection granted by the creepy little messengers, which can sometimes have vaginas for faces. Then I was free to explore. The old man didn't think to leave me a weapon, so I died pretty immediately, and was sent to the Hunter's Dream, a pocket dimension of some kind, which includes a sex doll and free weaponry. With weapons in hand now, off to Yharnam I go. The town appears to be cursed, as the villagers cough with illness and act on madness, sometimes sounding afraid of me or referring to me as a cursed beast. I kept exploring until I found a bridge, which was blocked by the church, keeping people trapped in this section of the town. The blockade defended by the church's monster, the cleric beast, who I knew was evil because it had a huge health bar. I killed that awesome bird deer thing, then came across Father Gascoigne shortly after, a hunter like myself, but he decided to pick a fight with me too, and turns out he was also a monster and needed to be slain. Maybe this is why the villagers called me a cursed beast. We did dress alike. After putting him down for the count, I found a way through to the cathedral ward. There was a friendly creature in the cathedral suggesting I bring people there for safety, so I went back to Yharnam and got the old lady to come here along with the other characters I met on my travels, including Ariana, some dude who didn't give me his name, and Adela, who seemed the nicest of the bunch. I met another hunter named Alfred. He seemed like a nice man, unlike this other absolute
Hunt.
Juror who has a Gatling gun. He's trying to build a haven for monsters, which is kind of cute, but I felt like I needed to kill him for the game's progression, so... Then me and Alfred became best friends and killed some blood-starved beast together because again, look at that health bar, it's clearly evil. Me and Henriette, whoever they are, then teamed up and fought Vicar Amelia, who seemed sad about her pendant, and with my intrusion became a giant dog monster. As you do. After teaching her to play dead, I read the mind of a skull to spot Master Willem, who struck me as a little paranoid before he prattled on about the importance of blood. Pale blood? He seems like my next target. With a side turn we headed out of Yharnam City and popped into Hemwick for a bit, where I stumbled across the Witch of Hemwick and her twin sister. Not sure why they picked a fight with me, although I did just wander into their house with weapons drawn, so naturally, I murdered them too, and then I circled back to the Forbidden Woods, found the hidden Smurf village, slaughtered them, met a man named Volta, and joined the League, which leads me to believe there are different groups of hunters, which would explain why I keep bumping into some that want to kill me as well. There must be some inner turmoil between groups. Then, a little further, 3 ring wraiths tried to take my precious. Killed those 3 dead, and was pretty thankful the other 6 must have been busy looking for Frodo. Bygone was my next stop, where I came across Damien, who had a bird cage on his head, because fashion doesn't always have to be comfortable. Turns out the low-hanging red moon blurs the line between man and beast. The Great Ones are descending, and a womb is going to be blessed with a child. And this is Master Willem's place. I can't wait to find out what he knows. Well, not much. He basically gestures at me to take a long walk off a short pier, and who am I to argue? Hang on, that moon looks different. Ah! After jumping to my death, there's a lake under the lake, which is home to Rom, the vacuous spider. Probably my least favourite boss fight. I managed to kill this personified yawn, which released the spirit of a woman in white. She seems sad, probably because her dress was ruined. She gestures to the moon, which cries not dissimilar to a baby. I guess the developers felt this was a little obscure, so they gave me a helping hand and told me I'm to seek the Nightmare Newborn. So now I'm hunting an evil baby. It must be somewhere in Yahagul, the unseen village, because that's where the game kind of puts me. Amygdalas watch over me as I explore this new land. What appears to be petrified bodies are melted into the walls. I want to say excellent craftsmanship, but I feel more likely to be some cruel twist of fate for the locals. Some notes suggested the Mensis ritual might be what has caused the influx of people becoming monsters. The previously crying moon then gives birth to a creature referred to as the One Reborn, who kept spitting up on me even after I killed all of its babysitters, but eventually it got some much needed rest. Behind the creature was a room of dead cage wearers, all looking their best. The central mummy was actually able to send me back to university, as I found myself in the lecture building. Lurking here are previous students still trying to pay off their student debts, but I have another solution for them. I then learnt about the nameless moon presence being summoned by Lawrence, and about needing to hunt the Great Ones. Also, 3 third chords, which I'm sure will make more sense later. Then through a door I found myself in the Nightmare Frontier. This place sucks, but I came across an Amygdala brave enough to actually fight me, and this thing was metal. It pulled its own arms off to use as weapons, so I killed that, then went to the Nightmare of Mensis, which is the evil ritual's name. I wonder if Mensis is the name of a Great One. In here was Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. Wearing that fashionable cage, he mentions Koz or Kozum, who I wonder if those are the names of more Great Ones, because he suggests they are prayed to, but I don't know for certain. After catching and killing him, he wails about forgetting everything as he wakes up. I think he might be the mummy that teleported me to the lecture building beforehand, and we're inside his nightmare, but the world doesn't collapse upon his death, so I'm unsure about that as well. Then I remembered what the third chords were from my first playthrough, where I found 1 or 2 before, so I went running back to Yosefka's clinic and killed her.
I'm so sorry, Philip.
Knowing she had one of them. Then I went on a journey to check in with my other NPC friends, and Ariana was missing. After way too much looking around, it turns out she was in the sewers behind, and she seemed distressed, and to have given birth to something. So I killed her too.
Sorry, Philip.
And got a second chord. 1 more to go. Then I continued to ascend the Mensis Tower, where more ring wraiths appeared to be wandering around, before I came across the woman with the ruined white dress again. Her hands appeared to have cuffs on them, implying she was a prisoner of sorts. Her choice of white implies she is pure in some way, and perhaps a victim in this twisted tale. She looked towards what I think is my next objective. I struck her down as well. Sorry. Just to be on the safe side. There were more cage heads, and the sound of a crying baby, defended by Murgo's wet nurse. And who is Murgo? Probably the woman in white's baby? I killed the wet nurse, and received the third umbilical cord. The description of these cords basically state every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate. Anyway, I have all three. Gonna eat these before I forget, and after dinner, I return to the Hunter's Dream, which someone had set on fire. The night is coming to an end, and Gehrman wants a word. Turns out, just like everything in the game, he wants to kill me too. I miss Alfred. Alfred never wanted to kill me, but Gehrman says it's to help me forget the terrible Hunter's Dream, which I refused, and now we're fighting, so naturally, he dies, but in death, sounded almost relieved. Then the moon presence is finally summoned. In my first playthrough, I'm pretty sure it turned me into Gehrman, but this time, I guess the three cords made it quite upset. I'm guessing it realised I had denied its evil little offspring. So, as everything does, it attacked me, and quickly found out what happens. So with that thing dead as well, the game shows a baby worm monster being collected by the doll. The baby worm thing is me? So I think I'm now the reincarnation of the moon presence, or a great one. But either way, the cycle continues as I reawaken again in Yharnam under the pale blood sky. So I think the woman in white might have been some kind of important leader figure, who was the mother of one of these eldritch godlike Great One's babies named Murgo, but it didn't survive, much like any other offspring. I also think the Healing Church successfully hunted and harvested a Great One at some point, and maybe it is trying to resurrect every pale blood moon by impregnating any unfortunate fertile woman it comes across. When it's doing this, it triggers people to transform into beasts because of the Mensis ritual that Mikolash performed before hiding away in his own nightmare world. Because I consumed the cords of the potential offspring, I was able to transform myself into the vessel and become a newly born Great One, I think. What's pale blood? I have no idea, probably something I killed along the way though. That's what I gather from the events of the game. It's pretty open to interpretation, and I'm fairly certain I still missed a lot of lore. But I think the game is about the Great Ones, and man's pursuit to obtain their insight and wisdom by perhaps having killed one or consuming one's blood. The player does heal through blood vials. Maybe there is something to that. Blood is definitely a theme. The hunter seeks pale blood, and must persevere through the madness and slowly obtains their own insight, seeing more eldritch horrors as the game progresses. In the end, Gehrman offers to free you from this cursed knowledge, much like we freed Mikolash, only to be denied as you become one with the gods. So let's explore narrative in a bit more detail as a subject. There are three types of narrative we typically see in media: explicit, implicit, and emergent. Explicit is when something is stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. Implicit being suggested, though not directly expressed, and emergent, which is in the process of coming into being or becoming prominent. Much of the explicit narrative comes from item descriptions, such as that of the thirds of the umbilical cords. By reading each of these, I piece together the main theme of the plot. Odin is the father of Murgo, and is the Great One seeking a child, and each time it is lost. The Hunter's Dream is related to this unholy period of conception. Corrupted blood, likely from a Great One, was used by humans, which is what has allowed this to happen. Perhaps starting with Willem, who has consumed a cord himself to try and gain the same insight as a Great One. So in consumption, it does appear that the hunter is indeed becoming closer to that of a Great One, lining their brain with eyes. And I'm fairly certain my ending was my hunter embodying this child Odin seeks. Implicit is the majority of the game's narrative. For instance, townsfolk referring to the player as a cursed beast, because in the end, I guess they were right. Other examples are people transforming into monsters before your eyes, the woman in white's visual design implying victimhood and broken purity, notes with just enough information to give you room to theorise about how it all interconnects. The world is mysterious, and the developers want you to feel that sense of mystery, and try to connect it yourself. And finally, elements of emergent are throughout, with dialogue choices and interchangeable interactions. I'm sure there was more to almost every NPC I came across, should I have spoken with them more, or found them again. For instance, Eileen the Crow. I only came across her once, but something tells me there is more to her story. The game has multiple endings, and though I chose to send everyone to the cathedral, I had the option to send them to Yusefka's clinic. How does this affect my storyline? I'd have to play again to find out. World building is the concept of staging player's space with environmental properties that can be interpreted as a meaningful whole, furthering the narrative of the game. The world's environment adds to the overall story. The petrified civilians that line the walls of Yahogul, or the blocked entranceways and burning bodies on the streets of Yharnam, tell a story. The night feels dire with the sound of madness echoing in the distance. So Bloodborne provides a very implicit narrative style, allowing the player to slowly put together the world, piece by piece, playthrough by playthrough. Notes and dialogue are cleverly crafted to hint at but not directly divulge every detail. For that, the player will need to bring all the elements together and will likely still be filling in some blanks. Some explicit elements are used to help with the main plot points. I wonder if to help the player uncover the true ending by slightly encouraging them to consume the chords if they read enough into the descriptions. These explicit elements are well hidden though, and the game does not overtly suggest you seek them out. And finally, the game gives you choices to build your own emergent style narrative, allowing each playthrough to give the player a sense of agency and make each new run feel unique. I would suggest the game could sometimes do more to help encourage the player though. For example, NPCs hidden behind lanterns. Perhaps I missed the messenger tooltip, but it didn't click that those lit lanterns signified an interactable NPC at first. Sometimes it's not a bad thing to explain your clever design in a clear manner. And one slightly jarring moment was after killing Rom the vacuous spider. The pop-up stating, "Ritual secret broken, seek the nightmare newborn." This doesn't really happen anywhere else in the game, so I can only assume in testing, players were particularly confused after defeating that boss. It feels like Bloodborne uses dialogue boxes every time they overlook an element of design, be it explaining how to play or developments in the narrative. Generally speaking, I think the world and narrative are excellent. Nothing feels out of place, and every element feels like it is there with purpose, leaving the player filled with intrigue and speculation. But it sometimes feels like key plot points can be easily missed altogether. Perhaps a little more inclusion of explicit storytelling could be beneficial in some areas. There were a number of bosses that I don't know why I went to fight. There's locations I travelled to and I have no idea why. These moments of confusion make parts of the game feel a little aimless, where the level design begins to carry the story. And with that, let's discuss my final thoughts of the game. Bloodborne's level design is perhaps amongst the best I've seen. Visually, the world not only looks fantastic, but supports the player's navigation through an excellent use of landmarks. Its styling could also be suggested to exert psychological pressure on the player, which coincides well with Bloodborne's gameplay, weakening one's ability to focus and react to the situations before them, as enemies lunge from the darkness, and bosses only give a second of warning before they smash down upon the hunter. Various Gothic styles and Neo-Baroque architecture blend together, managing to make areas feel unique from one another, but still keep the world feeling cohesive. Every area in every location feels special, no one view looks the same, so long as we ignore the Nightmare Frontier. Environments loop around with unlockable shortcuts and provide checkpoint lamps, which enable us to feel a sense of progression throughout. Micro and meso landmarks are scattered through the beautifully crafted scenes, allowing a player to quickly recognise if they've already explored an area, making navigation easy. The world is full of hidden secrets and rewards of lore or equipment to encourage a sense of exploration on your journey. Player experience is thus mostly great, with an easy to navigate world, and the game keeps the objectives simple, whilst the levels direct the player from pivotal boss fight to pivotal boss fight. Every moment feels challenging, with enemies providing a sense of danger at almost every turn with a sense of high risk, high reward. Battles feel epic with a combination of clear feedback, well-designed UI, an enthralling soundtrack, and skill-based gameplay, all leading to a strong state of game flow. The mechanics mostly all support a very clean core loop, which keeps the gameplay engaging. There is plenty of room for a player to customise their playstyle, with a variety of different weapons, equipable gear, and a levelling system which lets you choose your own skill set. Combat mechanics are simplified and allow players to focus and act with intentional purpose, further leaning into a feeling of skill. The narrative is intriguing and fantastical, with just enough breadcrumbs to see you wanting to learn more. Rewarded for exploration and seeking answers, the player can piece together the story and try to understand the Night of the Hunt, the Great Ones, and what on earth is going on. Multiple endings alongside various choices scattered throughout your time with the game can make every save file feel different, promoting multiple playthroughs as well. Though Bloodborne is not a perfect game. Players are mostly left to figure things out a lot on their own. Unlike the excellent level design, The tutorialization leaves a lot to desire. The game relies on a passive teaching style, which fails to ensure the player learns how to properly use any mechanics. The tutorial feels like an afterthought and is quite lackluster in design when compared to almost every other facet of the game. The respawn system can sometimes leave the player repeatedly running through the same environment time and time again, slowly realising almost all lesser enemies can be completely ignored. These moments of rushing back to an otherwise enjoyable boss fight can be quite frustrating, dull, and severely harming to one's state of flow. Blood vials are a nice way to support the player's ability to stay in a fight even after taking damage, but the resource management of them is sometimes also quite irritating. If I happen to run out, having to grind them feels like a needless chore, which again distracts from the main part of the game I want to engage with. The repair function continues to stand out to me as an unnecessary feature and fails to feel cohesive with the rest of the game. The only times it really plays a role is to in fact spoil my gameplay and again break my sense of flow. Though the narrative is interesting, it can sometimes feel too well hidden, where I am left acting in the dark, again relying solely on the level design to direct my gameplay, as I'm not sure why I am going in a certain direction, a certain location, or killing a certain enemy. Sometimes the game could perhaps benefit from a little more explicit storytelling. Overall, Bloodborne has a very clear and clean style of gameplay, with its well-crafted combat system and intense gameplay, but I feel it is overly reliant on its superb level design to make up for its weak ability to inform its users how to play and why they are doing something. The trouble is, a poorly executed dialogue box telling you to press R1 to attack stands out when placed next to the well-crafted level design, the beautifully composed soundtrack, or the engaging combat mechanics. The degree of effort in their design is not equal. Tutorials are an underappreciated and difficult element of game design. Miyazaki's games make the player feel accomplished and smart, and it's all thanks to his and his team's uncompromising approach. He refuses to over-explain the mechanics or the lore, but rather puts his trust in the players to figure it out on their own. Refusing to over-explain the mechanics feels like an excuse. Passively informing a player to press a button versus actively teaching them when to press it is not what I would call over-explaining. The same applies to moments such as the ritual secret broken, seek the nightmare newborn. These elements just feel poorly implemented and overlooked. I can appreciate that Bloodborne is a fantastic game. I understand why people love it so much. My analysis here surely shows how much of its design I can't help but be in awe of myself, but unfortunately, it only makes the poorer elements of its design stand out all the more. For me, the game flow breaks between failed boss fight attempts as I run through the environment again and again are too memorable. The lackluster attempts to teach me the mechanics or sometimes help me understand why I'm doing things altogether pull me out of the game world too often. Admittedly, I'm more casual. Completing a Souls-like FromSoftware game alone doesn't give me a feeling of prestige, any more than completing any of the Armored Core games has done in the past. I also don't believe Souls-like games are necessarily for me as a genre, so my personal score would be to give Bloodborne a 7 out of 10. To be clear, that's a good score. I am not IGN. Not every good game is a 9 or a 10, and every bad game being a 6 or a 7. In university grading, 70% is the highest grade boundary. Some of my favourite games of all time I would also give a 7 out of 10. I wanted to make that clear because the Souls-like community can be a little defensive of the games they love. Bloodborne in particular has a very passionate player base, which is honestly another testament to the game's design. But hopefully, I've done a good job of explaining and justifying my opinions within this analysis. I generally have a high opinion of the game overall. When it's great, it's really great. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How do you feel about my opinion? Is my synopsis and understanding of the game's story even close to being accurate? How do you feel about the tutorialization early on in the game yourselves? If you enjoyed the video and want to see more like it, remember to leave a like and subscribe. Also, feel free to recommend other games you'd like to see me analyse in a bit more detail in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you're having a fantastic day, and happy hunting!